So let's take a few minutes and look at what folklore and traditional fantasy genres mean for children's literature. Stories from the oral tradition had their beginnings around hearthside and campfire. Here I've chosen 5 images of people telling stories, both from the past and in the closer present, from all walks of life and from all different cultures. And because these stories were born in the oral tradition, no one knows who first told each tale or which version is the original. Therefore, folklore is defined as stories that originated orally and have no authors. So we often associate these tales with a collector or a reteller, like the Grimm brothers. They collected, retold, and recorded European varieties of some of the best known traditional tales in Western culture, like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, Little Red Riding Hood. Those were all tales they collected from oral tradition and then retold in book form. Tales from other oral tradition are a part of the fabric of every culture, as we see here, and as we think to other stories that we've read and heard. 1001 Arabian Nights, that has the story of Aladdin, Tales of the Middle East, Tales of Buddha, Tales from Jewish tradition, Asian, African, Native American. They're all part of that oral storytelling tradition. And it's amazing how some of them really overlap each other. But these traditional stories differ in various ways from our modern writings. And so let's look at the peculiarities of folklore. When we read folklore and traditional stories, we're going to find that some of these things hold true. When we read a modern story, we want our characters to be well developed. We kind of want to be able to really picture them in their mind's eye. What they look like, what they're wearing, what they do. But that doesn't always happen in traditional fantasy. In traditional fantasy and folklore, the character development is pretty lean and spare. Those characters are generally archetypes, which means that they're meant to be symbolic of human traits like good and evil. And so we don't see that characterization that happens in our modern stories. We don't see the mix of good and bad. Either people are good or they are bad. Think of the fairy tales you've read. People in those stories, Cinderella is good, almost perfectly good. Everybody else is, well, not everybody, but the bad characters are just that. They are bad through and through. There's nothing good about any of them. So in traditional tales, we find those single-faceted characters who don't change during the story. And so they tell those tales of our experience, told in black and white. You know, this happens, that happens. So the plots are simple and direct. Because they were told by and among common folk, usually, they're often success stories that show how the underdog made good, like the youngest son or daughter, the little tailor, any unwanted children, and that success is often obtained against overwhelming odds, like accomplishing an impossible task. Think of spinning the straw into gold, or slaying some kind of an invincible monster. And so these storylines are also accompanied by typical themes. And those themes include rewards of mercy, kindness, perseverance, justice. And we like to set them, they were usually set in the distant past. Those once upon a time tales that we think about in fairy tales or traditional or folklore. Other elements include the fact that time passes very quickly. Sleeping Beauty was asleep for 100 years in the original tale. But that time passed really quickly. And then finally, there's usually some kind of a repeated pattern or element within the story. Perhaps the magical number 3 appears frequently. Or a refrain is repeated throughout. And we can think of that magical number 3. Rumpelstiltskin appears 3 evenings spinning straw. There's Cinderella has 3 visits to the ball. There's 3 trips up the beanstalk for Jack. Or that repeat of a refrain, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman, that repeats throughout the story. So these are the kind of things that make traditional fantasy or the genre of folklore a little more peculiar or different than what we think of when we think of modern literature. And as we talked earlier, folklore is pretty universal. And these tales deal with basic human experiences, told from that perspective of good versus evil, good triumphs over bad. There's always a constant allusion in our own literature or in our own conversation to traditional literature, such as when we say or write that, misery loves company, or you're judged by the company you keep. Those both come from the fables of Aesop. And Aesop's fables were collected from that oral tradition. And traditional fantasy is actually considered the mother of all literature, because when we begin writing, our stories, our ideas, the tales that we tell are all come from those past stories that we've heard. It's amazing how in Number of the Stars, when Lois Lowry's character is making her way through the forest, through the woods, she's carrying a basket, and it has food, and that food is hiding chemicals to drug the guard dogs. Okay, and as she's going, she starts remembering, and here's a quote from the book, that the handle of the straw basket scratched her arm through her sweater. She shifted it and tried to run. She thought of a story she had often told to Christy as they cuddled in bed at night. Once upon a time there was a little girl, she told herself silently, who had a beautiful red cloak. So again, it's that allusion to the traditional fantasy. And it's pulled into all and a lot of our modern literature. So what kinds of folklore are there? There's folk tales. And folk tales are, well, tales are considered folk tales, if they follow some of these common characteristics. Okay, there's cumulative tales. They're added on as the story unfolds. The House That Jack Built, I Know an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly. Those are some examples of cumulative tales. There's pourquoi, which means why in French, and they answer questions or they give explanations for the way things are. So, why the bear stumpy-tailed, or why mosquitoes buzz in people's ears. We have tales about beasts, or beast tales, Three Little Pigs, Three Billy Goats Gruff. Trickster tales. And trickster tales, that's one of the, not the name of the book, but you read a book about tricksters for this genre. Noodlehead or numbskull tales. Okay, those are the ones that are humorous, and they center on characters who are just not very smart. Grimm's Hans and Luck is one of them. Hans and Luck is a simpleton who stumbles merrily through life, coming out on top only because of providence. So the story's about people that you think there is no way that person could ever be successful. And I want from this one, these kind of stories in oral tradition, we can think of a lot of movie tales that work along that premise. And I think of the Pink Panther movies off the top of my head. You know, Inspector Clouseau is a knucklehead, but in the end, he's successful. Okay. Then there are realistic tales. They seem to have their basis in an actual historical event or something that happened in history. There's also the fairy tales, and these are probably the most popular or the most well-known and the most magical. They're the ones that have, you know, the fairy godmothers, magical objects, and just those stories that we love to listen to over and over again. So those are the different kinds of folk tales. Then there's tall tales. And we have a picture of a tall tale, American tall tale, here on this slide. Anybody know who that is? That's right, that's old Paul Bunyan. Okay. Paul Bunyan is a tall tale. It's a tale that grew out of the push to open the North American continent to settlement. So it's an exaggerated tale of how this guy, big guy, lumberjack, helped clear the forest so people could settle in the West. Okay. Then there's fables. And fables are brief stories meant to teach a lesson and usually conclude with a moral. And we all know examples of different kinds of fables. And Aesop's fables are probably the most popular that we know about. Then there's myths. When I think of myths, we think of Greek mythology, I think of. But so myths grew out of the early people's need to understand and explain the world around them. And so they recount creation of the world and tell of the gods and goddesses who control the fate of humans. So Greek myths, Roman myths, and there are Native American myths, there's Hindu myths, there are Islamic myths, there are myths, Chinese myths, pretty much from every single culture and nationality. Then there are epics, ballads, and legends. And the unifying feature of these three kinds of folklore is the hero tale. And that's that unifying feature. And an epic, then, is a hero tale that is really lengthy and tells a series of tales focusing on one hero, like the Iliad, which tells the tale of the Trojan War. The return of Odysseus from Troy to his home in Ithaca, which is the Odyssey. Okay? Those are epics. Ballads are hero stories told in poetic form. And then the heroes in the legends are rooted a bit more firmly in history. Okay? So those are epics, ballads, and legends, usually having to do with focusing on some kind of a hero, and a lot written in poetic form. Okay? Although Robin Hood could be also considered a legend. Then finally there are religious stories. And, classifying these as folklore or myth bothers some people. But the myth in this sense can be broadly defined as the human quest to discover and share truth concerning the spiritual aspects of existence. So if that's how we define myth, then religious stories fit here. And simply because we replace religious stories with folklore doesn't mean that we can't believe they're true. So, folklore is an important piece of literature. We need to expose children to the traditional stories, the old stories, because they are the basis of so many of our modern stories. How many different varieties or retellings of Cinderella can you think of? Think of movies. Think of the Cinderella theme. The good girl who has everything against her, who finds her Prince Charming. There's those kind of stories everywhere. Cinderella is a huge theme in stories and movies. Okay? So we need to promote folklore. We need to help children understand that appreciating fairy tales and folklore is worthwhile. That reading those kinds of stories is worthwhile. And we also need to make sure that we combat those people who want to diminish the importance of folklore. And there's three reasons usually that they do that. One is psychological fantasy. They think that kids are going to start losing touch with reality if they read too much of these kinds of fantasies. Another is the violence. There is a lot of violence in fantasy and traditional fantasy. But I want to say that with the violence, we have to temper that with the fact that in the end of many of these stories, it's the good that triumphs over the violence. And so by understanding the theme of the story, that the child begins to understand that evil behavior is likely to be punished and good behavior based on obedience or avoidance of evil that's implicit in being disobedient. So in other words, if I'm bad, I'm going to be punished. If I follow the rules and do what I'm supposed to, then I won't get that violent consequence. So yes, there is violence, but we have to be able to talk to our children about how that kind of violence leads to the good in the end. And because they are violent, some of the stories can be frightening. And many adults worry that some of those traditional tales are going to frighten children, that might cause nightmares and other kinds of distress. But because the dangerous story elements, such as wicked witches and dragons, are far removed in both time and place from their lives, they're much less frightening than realistic stories of danger that focus on real-life fears. So a lot of times the frightening elements in a fairy tale or a folk story are easier for children to deal with than the frightening elements in a more realistic tale. And then finally, people think that folklore is a waste of time. And some adults just bypass it when making selections in favor of more substantial stories and books about the real world. But there's no genre of literature that better fosters creativity than fantasy, both traditional and, as we'll talk about later, modern fantasy. And children, it's been shown that children who are immersed in high fantasy tend to be more highly structured and creative. So, as the story goes, and I'm going to finish with this. This is from Albert Einstein. As the story goes, a woman with a mathematically gifted son asked Albert Einstein how she should best foster his talent. After a moment of thought, Einstein answered, "Read him the great myths of the past. Stretch his imagination." So, if fantasy helps stretch the imagination, then let's not forget to have our kids get involved with fantastic magical tales.